Bulavinaka, Fiji, and Bulavinaka to all our listeners on Gold FM in Fiji and those who are joining us via the World Wide Web. Welcome to another episode of Speak Your Mind. As promised last week, we have the AG back on the show again today to talk more on the Constitution. Now, I know that there has been a lot of questions. We've spoke a lot during the last segment, and we intend to talk a lot more during this segment. Mr. Said Qayyum, so welcome to the show again today.
Oh, thank you for having me back.
Just getting right into it, Mr. Said Qayyum. I know since our last talk, we spoke a lot on issues like immunity, the presidency, and elections. Now, since our last talk, there has been a lot of questions also on the elections and how the process of it. I know there'll be some education on it, but can you just give us just a brief rundown again on how elections will happen and how will people get to vote?
Well, Roland, as you know, that the Constitution provides a single constituency for the entire country, and the voting is on proportional representation basis, and there are 50 seats in Parliament, and there is no Senate. There's a single house. Like in New Zealand, they also have a single house. And it's on proportional representation. Basically means, putting it very simply, that the proportion of votes that a political party gets, or the number of votes that it gets, will be the number of seats they get in Parliament will be in proportion to the percentage of votes they've got. So, for example, put simply, if a political party has got 20% of all the votes, they'll get 20% of the seats in Parliament. And as seen, political parties like NFP previously, they received in some instances, 15, 20, 25% of the votes, but they did not win a single seat. So political parties will in fact be those types of political parties will be the beneficiaries of such a system. Many countries adopt this. Many countries also have a similar system. Countries like Israel and Netherlands have a single constituency. In terms of the actual mechanics of the elections, how that will translate, as we have said already, that we would like the elections to be conducted in one day. It can be done. We also, as you saw, I think a couple of days ago, it was in the Fiji Sun, when the Indonesian ambassador to Fiji was interviewed on elections. They have 130 million voters, 10,000 islands. They actually vote only in 5 hours.
Right. We also had his interview on FBC. I think it was on Sunday.
Okay.
He had also mentioned that they've offered assistance to the Fijian government.
Yes.
How's that coming along?
We've had 1 or 2 meetings with them. We also had a meeting on Friday with all the development partners that want to contribute towards assisting the Fijian Elections Office. There has been, as you know, a report prepared by the experts from the EU, Commonwealth, and New Zealand. And they've identified areas, identified timelines and milestones that need to be achieved by a particular period. And so we've given the reports to them, and they will now come back to us to say which areas that they can provide assistance in. And there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done, apart from appointing the supervisor of elections, the electoral commissioners, but also, in developing HR manuals for the elections office. But also then on the next step would be changing some of the structures to make sure that it's responsive to what we want in terms of holding elections in one day. So there's quite a lot of work to be done. We also need to draft the regulations that will help decide on some of the operational aspects of running the elections office, and also the elections day itself. For example, we need to clearly define what are the rules and objective rules pertaining to the returning officers. What happens, for example, when ballot boxes come in? What happens when ballot boxes go out? How will reconciliation be done? All those sorts of aspects. And given it's, of course, proportional representation, do we use, at the moment the thinking is that because there's 50 seats, to have the names of the people up in the political party, in the polling booths when you actually go to vote, and photographs so you can see who they are, and then you can cast a vote. Either use just a numbering system. All those things will be sorted out. There's quite a lot of work to be done in that respect, because we are coming from the basis that we need to ensure that all the rules and regulations and the processes are known to the public very much early on in the piece, and to political parties also. Now, we should have them done by the end of this year. So even if elections are held in September next year, at least you've got 9 months to be familiar with those rules.
Do you think 9 months is enough time, Mr. Sadkayum?
To become familiar with the rules, yes, most definitely. I mean, the fact is, it's you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know it, but the fact is that you need to be familiar with them. The next stage, of course, is once all of that is done, is the voter education. We need to educate the voters as to what happens on the day. Okay, these are the systems, and this is how you cast a vote. When you walk in, this is what will happen. You'll be given a paper. You need to take your EVR card, all of those sorts of things. So the reason why I can't give you all the specific details is once all the rules are done, then we can say, okay, this is exactly what will happen. But I can tell you some of the fundamental objectives. That is to have elections conducted in one day, that the voting needs to be counted, or the votes need to be counted wherever the votes are cast, so people get to see what is happening. You get the results quicker. They are the sort of key principles. That
How long does it normally take before the results are known?
Well, I mean, in Indonesia's case, they get the results almost on the same day. That's why they have only 5 hours. So the rest of the time they sort of spend counting. They obviously have 130 million votes to count if everybody turns up to vote. In the Fijian experience, of course, it'll be a lot more different in the sense that the volume is far less. But nonetheless, we need to work within our capacity also. We need to have more polling stations. We don't want people to go and stand in the queue for 5-6 hours just to cast a vote. We want it to be simple. It needs to be it needs to be seamless, and that's the objective. So by having more polling booths will obviously mean we need to recruit more people. But the fact is that it won't be a chore for the voter. We want the voters to be enticed to go and vote. We need to have a high voter turnout. We want everybody to vote.
If you're listening in from home or from the office, 3220-906 or 3220-907 is the number to call if you have any questions for the AG on the Constitution, or if you need any clarification on any provisions within the Constitution. You can also email us, goldfm@fbc.com.fj. Now, Mr. Sadkayum, before we leave the topic of elections, looking back at the last elections, there was reports in the media of some anomalies that were found. What's in this Constitution that will ensure that these anomalies or the same experience is not repeated?
Well, the Constitution generally sets out the form of electoral representation, which is, in this case, proportional representation, as opposed to what they call the alternative vote under the 1997 Constitution, which was actually to the detriment of political parties that got a high percentage of votes, or reasonable percentage of votes, but did not win a single seat. And of course the number of seats in Parliament. In terms of the anomalies, if you look at the EU report, the Observer report on the 2006 elections, a lot of it had to do with the specific implementation of the processes. So the anomalies were, for example, that previously you had to publish the preferences of the political parties. So if you ticked above the line, you should know exactly how your preferences, or how the preferences would go for that political party. And that noted that it published, the Supervisor of Elections Office published the preferences in the Daily Post.
So I'll have to stop you there. We will go into a short commercial break. When we return, we'll talk more on these anomalies and how this Constitution will ensure that these anomalies are not repeated. Welcome back. You're on Speak Your Mind on Gold FM. The topic today is Constitution. We spoke about this last week and we're still talking about it this week to ensure that you, the public, gets familiar with your Constitution. In studio with us is the Attorney General, Mr. Ayaz Sadkayum. The number to call is 3220-906 or 3220-907 if you have any queries or if you need any clarifications. Email is goldfm@fbc.com.fj. Mr. Sadkayum, you're talking about anomalies of the last elections.
Yes, so they published the preferences in the Daily Post. I think we had a circulation of about 200 or 400. So they met the substance of the requirement of the regulation, which was to publish it. They met the form, I should say, of the requirement, which is, you need to publish it. But they did not meet the substance. I mean, the substance of that particular requirement was that everybody gets to know. So if you're going to publish it in a newspaper that has a circulation of 200 or 400, how will people know? So you've met the requirement, but you have not met the actual intention behind the requirement. So that's one. For example, in one of the seats in Dhakondrove, there was a voter turnout of 101%. So obviously there were more votes in the ballot box than the actual people who lived in that area. So obviously there was fraud. More people voted. I mean, people would have voted more than once. They also identified, for example, some other issues pertaining to the lack of coordination and lack of response by the Supervisor of Elections Office to the Electoral Commission. They also identified areas where the recruitment processes weren't transparent. There's very low representation of women in the entire process. So, I mean, there are some of them, ones that I can remember. They also identified, for example, that the wooden ballot boxes that have been used, a very archaic way of having a ballot box. They identified that there was a gap between the lid of the box and the body of the box, so things could be slipped in. All those sorts of anomalies were occurring, and in terms of security of the ballot boxes. So this is why you see that when we had advertised calling for expressions of interest for people to supply material for the elections, for the upcoming elections, we said it must be UN compliant. So you cannot have ballot boxes that can be tampered with. For example, if somebody does tamper with it, it has been tampered with. The ballot papers from the last elections has not even been reconciled. How many ballot papers are printed? How many were sent out to the polling stations? How many were used? And how many were unused? And then you have to reconcile that with the number that has been used. They all need to match up. That hasn't been done. So the reconciliation under this constitution, you'll see there's clear need for transparency and all of that. But also, for example, there is a provision if you want to challenge a particular decision of the Electoral Commission, you can actually go to the Court of Disputed Returns, which is the High Court. And the court must give its ruling within 21 days. In order for the court to do that, obviously the reconciliation needs to be done. And it should not be a laborious task. It actually should be quite easy. If your processes are transparent, everything should be easy. And that's what we are focused on. And I think we've given that message to the development partners. We also need to ensure that, as we've said, to make voting not a chore. And I think, in terms of generally when we talk about democracy or your ability to choose, it should not only be limited to general elections. We participate in various other organizations, whether it's voting bodies, whether municipal council level, or at the provincial level, whatever the case may be, and we elect people. We need to have democracy in those organizations too, in trade unions, etc. So the elections office should be a body that can be responsive to conducting elections for those organizations too. People should want the elections office to come and conduct it for them because it's an independent body. It must specialize in elections. And that's what we intend to do, is to build it into a body that has a good reputation and has got credibility. And of course, elections now will be held sooner rather than later. It will be held at least every 4 years. In fact, at least every 3.5 years it can be held, maximum 4 years.
Do we have a supervisor of elections, Mr. Said Qayyum, and are we using one?
No, we don't have one yet. We'll be advertising. In fact, we should see the ad come out in the next couple of days. And we want to advertise internationally and get as much interest as possible generated through the advertisement process. It's critical, in particular if you're going to hold elections in one day, to have people who have that level of experience. And there are some very good people out there, and our development partners have shown an interest to assist us with that, and indeed even fund at least partially for that position, provide funding for that position. So we're quite keen, and of course the president signs the constitution, or assents to the constitution on the 6th of September, which I understand
This Friday.
your TV station is carrying live.
Yep.
And then when it comes into effect, we of course need to appoint the electoral commissioners, because then they can also start, having more carriage of the matters pertaining to the elections office.
Mr. Said Kayum, since our last conversation last week, Monday, I believe, there's been I've just gone through the internet and just looked for different reactions to the Constitution, release of the Constitution. Australia's welcomed the Constitution. Senator Bob Carr has said it in public, in the media. New Zealand also, I've heard they've also accepted the Constitution. What does this say for Fiji?
Well, I think what it says for the Constitution, firstly, I think it is a endorsement of the provisions in the Constitution. I read a comment by an academic from New Zealand, whose name I forget. He said, using his words, it's a very liberal constitution for a military government, using his words. But the point is, I think, as we've always said from the beginning, and the Prime Minister said when he made the announcement on 1 July 2009, when he set out the roadmap and the strategic framework for change, that the entire process and the outcome, we always wanted to be credible. We wanted to address all the fundamental issues that needed to be addressed. And then we move along in ensuring that we create a very strong, stable, and prosperous country for the benefit of all Fijians, not just for the benefit of the elite few. So the Constitution, you can see that is very, very far-reaching. It enshrines socioeconomic rights for the first time. It quite specifically enunciates protection for Itauke land, Banaban land, and Rutuman land, not just the protection of the ownership, but indeed the continuation of that. It gives new rights in terms of the ability to share the dividends with the state, for example, with minerals. Unfair discrimination is not allowed on the basis of culture. So all of these new provisions have been put in, more accountable institutions, the fact that public office holders now need to be accountable to an independent body. It augurs quite well, and we receive very, very positive feedback from ordinary people, unsolicited. We don't go up to them; actually come up to us and say, "This is very good." So I think that's why perhaps these two countries have also recognized that, and the reality is that the elections will be conducted under this constitution, and the system, the electoral system, is also quite. We've done a lot of research vis-a-vis the submissions we received, and have come up with a system that's been enshrined in the Constitution.
Thank you for that, Mr. Said Kayum. We'll go into another short break, and when we get back, we'll talk on some other provisions that's in the Constitution that we were not able to discuss in our last talk last week. Welcome back. This is Speaking Your Mind. The topic today is the Constitution and the provisions in it. If you have any questions, call us 3220-906 or 3220-907. If you have any questions for the AG, Mr. Said Kayum is our chief guest today. So before we get into the provisions of the Constitution, let's just talk on one more issue that we spoke on last week, which also aroused more questions, is the appointment of the president by Parliament. The question is just, can you tell us why it was decided that it be chosen by Parliament and not by the people?
Well, the Parliament is representative of the people, because you elect the Parliament, you elect the members. So they are your representatives in Parliament, and they are speaking for you. In fact, a similar recommendation was made in the Reeves Commission for the 1997 Constitution, in fact. They had at that time recommended that they, of course, had the Senate too. So the Senate and the House of Reps should sit together, and then they nominate names, and then they elect the president. So the rationale behind this is that the leader of opposition and the Prime Minister nominate individuals, and you could have bipartisan support for this, and appoint somebody that's going to be a credible, transparent person with dignity and honor to be the head of the state. And he or she is chosen by the parliament, which is the representative of the voters.
Right. And going back into the constitution, Mr. Setkem, one issue that we had failed or we didn't have time to talk on was socioeconomic rights. Would you like to brief us on that?
So I think, Roland, just before I probably touch on those specific rights, there's also the right to information. I think which is very important, which as opposed to, you have the freedom of information, but right to information, access to information actually is Section 25, which talks about the how you have the right to information held by any public office about you, and indeed how you have the right to have the correction or deletion of false or misleading information that affects that person. Yesterday we opened the new birth, death and marriage office in Lautoka. And, there are so many times when we've had people who've come up to us in the office in Suva and said, for example, my name is, Isireli. But when they registered my name, they misspelled it. They just wrote Sireli. They missed out the I. And nobody's changing it. They won't allow me to change it. And these are very sort of everyday, what some people may consider very mundane or small issues, but in fact it's very important to that individual. And so now you have a right to be able to ensure that the officers that work at BDM actually make those corrections, or they spelled, Prasad wrongly, or Pedeli wrongly, or Elizabeth wrongly, whatever it may be. You have the right to change that. People say, oh, sometimes they've written my birth of date is wrong. Birth date is wrong, they put it incorrectly. These are very basic things, but they're everyday issues. And, it irks people when they can't change information pertaining to them. I no longer live at 59 Milverton Road. I live in Brown Street, whatever the case may be. Now, in terms of the specific rights to socioeconomic rights, you'll see there, it talks about the right to education, which was actually there in the 1997 Constitution, but not as specific and elaborate as this. In fact, this goes a lot further. It basically says everybody's right to early childhood education, primary and secondary education, and further education, which is tertiary education, of course, and other vocational training. And then it says that the state must take reasonable measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of the right to free education. So it must slowly always build up towards that, to free education. And also it says for education for persons who are unable to complete the primary and secondary education. The third component is the conversational and contemporary Tauke and Fiji Hindi languages shall be taught as compulsory subjects.
Before we go to that one, Mr. Satkem, right to education, would you say that Fiji is already working towards that direction?
Definitely, the Beni Marama government is working towards that. As the Prime Minister made an announcement earlier this year, for example, there was an additional $2 million allocated for the scholarship. But he's already made an announcement, the Prime Minister, that he's working on some other aspect of it to make it a lot more accessible. So the government is quite committed to this. And I think if you look at the socio-economic rights, right to economic participation, right to work, just minimum wage, access to transportation, right to housing, sanitation, adequate food and water, social security schemes, right to health. These rights have never been included in any of the constitutions in Fiji. What it does is when people before they vote, obviously the political parties will come and campaign. You should be able to ask them, what is your policy on this? When will you, for example, ensure that we get free education? What is your policy on health and sanitation and housing? How do you intend to implement your policies? What are the costings? Now, you'll be able to do this because once the President assents to the Constitution, we intend to disseminate freely the Constitution, pocket-sized versions. And that's why it's also been translated in the vernaculars also. In fact, we're printing about 200,000 copies of it in the English language, 150,000 in Itauke, and at the moment 50,000 in Hindi, because there are a lot more people very few people who read what they call the Devanagari script. But of course, there's a need for increasing the publication numbers. We'll do that. But it's for wide dissemination. So you carry it in your own pocket or in your own home, and you're able to read it yourself. And it's written in plain language. And it's also been translated. So we want people to know exactly what their rights are, and they're able to question the political parties. But it also, as I said last week, that political parties now don't have a choice. They have to address these issues because it is your right as a citizen. So it does not depend whether they're on the left or right of politics, or whether they're pro-business, pro-labor, and all that type of stuff. They need to be able to focus on these issues.
One of my questions also was leading up to this, Mr. Said Qayyum, was during campaigning, political parties campaigning. Is there anything in the constitution or maybe provisions that would ensure that they're held true to their word? I mean, whatever they promise people, it's been the issue in so many years, past years.
Well, no, there's nothing in the constitution. Nor do I think you can actually make it a legal requirement. I mean, because normally when you make something a legal requirement, you must have the ability to enforce it. And the next step is if somebody does not follow it, then there needs to be consequences. So what will be the consequences? But I think there needs to be a higher level of public debate. And I think the media also needs to play a very key role. I mean, unfortunately, the media in Fiji, to be frank, is always concerned about what he said, what then you said in response, and what he said is like, they just report what people say about each other. It becomes into mudslinging process. But unfortunately, a lot of the journalists don't actually focus on the substance of the issues. Like in Australia at the moment, there's a big debate. And indeed, it has always been the case where if a political party says, I will do X, Y, Z for you, I will bring, family assistance, this, the media actually questions, say, well, how will you fund it? Where will you get the money from? It's okay to make these promises. Where will you get the money from?
I'll have to stop you again there, Mr. Said Qayyum. When we come back, we'll talk more on the role of the media and leading up to elections next in 2014. Welcome back. You're on Gold FM's Speak Your Mind. Continuing from last week's episode, we're talking about the Constitution. And in studio today is the Attorney General, Mr. Ayaz Said Qayyum. So we were talking about the role of the media. I understand they also have a critical role to play in the lead up to elections.
Yeah, I think, they play a very educative role, and they need to play a very informative role. Information is not just about what politician A said and what politician B said in response. That's what seems to be the sort of way that media or journalists report so-called political happenings in Fiji. You will hardly find any journalist that will actually go out and do analysis themselves. I mean, sometimes what a politician may say and cite, for example, a particular law, that they are not telling the truth. It does not fit in with what the law is saying. But the journalists don't have the confidence to go out and say, well, Mr. A said this, but in fact, Section 5 says something else. So it's incorrect. But what they do is they'll go running off to the other side. Oh, he said that. What do you have to say to that? You need to be able to go out on a limb and make that analysis. In the same way, we don't have many opinion pieces in Fiji. As we said at the CPA conference, even accountants, lawyers, academics, nobody seems to go out and professionally do an analysis of a particular policy statement. You will never see, for example, an accountant or a financial advisor come out during or before elections and say, well, political party A has said this, but I've done analysis, it will cost this much money. And that, in fact, is quite unrealistic because the government has a far less revenue source. Nobody does that because people don't want to go out on a limb, or unfortunately also, and it's also the media and our conditioning, that if somebody does analysis, they say, oh, this guy belongs to the political party. Oh, he's saying that because he goes to this church. Oh, he's doing because he goes, belongs to this denomination, or because of his ethnicity. So we need to get out of that, because how will be well-informed society? We need to be a well-informed society. We need to nurture the idea of having good, independent, critical analysis I mean, many of the analysis or so-called criticisms of the Beni Marama government, many of them have been done by people who've got a political agenda, but they hide behind the guise of something else. So I think we need to, now that we're going to the sort of election mode from next year in particular, although some political parties are sort of shaping up now, we need to nurture independent analysis. We have some academics, I know some media organizations go running off to them all the time. Economists, they have been politicians themselves. They have a particular political taint, and so sometimes their analysis of the economy is not necessarily in an independent fashion, done in an independent fashion. They're doing it depends on who they favor. I mean, in the same way, somebody can say to you, well, I don't think the tourism industry is going to do well because the numbers same time last year was higher, this year it's lower. Maybe it's even lower by 2,000. But have they looked at what's the yield from the tourism numbers? You can have 5,000 tourists coming into Fiji and spending $1,000 each. Or you can have 1,000 tourists coming to Fiji and spending $15,000 each. Which one is better?
Just going back to the media, the role of the media, Mr. Said Qayyum, you would also know that the media also has copped a lot of criticism from overseas media on being pro-government, this and that. What do you think the media in Fiji does have the freedom to report fairly?
Well, of course, it goes without saying. I mean, but I think you see again the unfortunate thing. We're sort of going outside the sort of constitution discussions. But I think there's a number of media outlets in Australia and New Zealand. Of course, they also have their own agendas. In fact, I remember a few years ago when the former Solicitor General made a complaint to the Media Industry Council or equivalent thereof in New Zealand. They actually came back and said, well, we've said this because we're following the foreign policy of our government. That was their response. So obviously not necessarily independent. But I think the point is that whilst there is no control of the media, I think the media needs to also gain credibility too. The journalists need to become a lot more professional in terms of how they carry out analysis. They should not simply be reporting, oh, he said that and she said that. They need to carry out, ask the deeper questions with the view of informing the public at large. So when the public goes out to vote, they have thought about, they're well-informed voter. They have all the views on it's like a smorgasbord. You've got all the different ideas there. After reviewing all of that, you choose what you want. You choose what you want to eat.
Right. We going a bit off topic. Let's jump back into the Constitution, Mr. Said. You're talking about right to education, and you were just about to speak on the conversational and contemporary Itoke and Fiji Hindi languages that shall be taught in primary schools. Yeah? Now, there could be some arguments. I'm talking about the Fiji Hindi language here, that it can't be taught. Someone mentioned over the news that it can't be taught, and it would have been preferred if the Sud Hindi would have been taught in primary schools. What would you say to that?
It can be taught, actually. The fact is that people just have not tried teaching it. There's been a lot of papers written on it, that it has its own grammar, etc. It's not the idea of teaching Sud Hindi. Nobody speaks Sud Hindi. Conversational Hindi is spoken. They sort of, Sud, or what they call the formal Hindi. People don't speak formal Hindi in Fiji. You may go to some ceremonies or, some prayers or, formal gatherings where people will do that. But then suddenly, as soon as they turn around to have a conversation with you, they break out in Fiji Hindi. And that obviously is a language that is peculiar to Fiji, and that obviously, needs to be spoken. And people who do not have Fiji Hindi as their mother tongue, when they do speak in Hindi, they actually speak Fiji Hindi. If you go to Mba and Lautoka and Nanrongai and all those places where people speak the three languages, they actually speak contemporary Itauke, contemporary Hindi, Fiji Hindi. That's the reason why it's there. I think those people who are sort of fairly conservative will have that argument, but I think it is there for practical reason. And there are many, in fact, positive outcomes from this. You'll have more speakers of the Itauke language. The language is not lost; it's more enriched, and more people speak it. Fiji Hindi, a similar thing happens there too. But also to be able to converse with each other. You share the jokes, and it brings about a lot more understanding. Thirdly, as I was saying at the CPA conference, that from a purely business perspective too, and from a civil service perspective too, at the moment sometimes somebody who may, for example, only speak Itauke.
It becomes an advantage speaking
Well,
three
if
languages.
somebody only speaks Itauke, they want to go to a government counter for a service, and the person on the other side may not speak Itauke. Or they go to a phone shop and they want something explained to them about their phone. They need to speak in the vernacular. You will have in 10, 15 years' time a whole group of people who will speak all three languages. There's an employer, they're all employable.
Very true, sir. Very true. We'll go into another short break, and when we return, we'll talk more on the Constitution in our last segment of Speak Your Mind for this episode. Bulavinaka, and welcome to the fifth and last segment of Speak Your Mind for this episode. We're talking about the Constitution, and we've spoken about elections, we've spoken about the right to education, we've spoken about the appointment of the president. Let's just move on, and still on socioeconomic rights, Mr. Said Qayyum, the right to work and the right to a just and minimum wage. What does this say about, what does the Constitution say about this?
Well, essentially what it says, the state must take reasonable measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of the right of every person to work and to a just minimum wage. And indeed, a lot of work has already been done in terms of achieving minimum wage. As you know, that there are a number of professions or employment categories that have very low hourly rates that has been increased progressively over the past few years. Obviously, a lot more work needs to be done. It's always a balancing act, but I think the idea that we're saying must be just. It means you cannot exploit people. Dr. Reddy, as you know, is also working at the moment through the Commerce Commission on establishing, for example, a framework for a minimum wage, regulatory framework for that, and that obviously needs to be assessed very carefully also. So every government, and the first leg of that is about employment, the right of every person to work. So every government must be focusing on trying to create employment, to ensure that people are employed. It's not an option. That's the whole idea of having socioeconomic rights. And indeed,
when you have housing and sanitation,
you have housing and sanitation,
rights to adequate food and water.
Adequate food and water, so nobody in Fiji should die from hunger, or they should be free from hunger. Of course, it doesn't mean that government is going to go and buy everybody's groceries. But what it means is that there are people, obviously, who may be starving. We need to provide and care for them. There may be instances, for example, where these people don't have water. We need to ensure that everybody gets water. So it puts the burden is on the state. The burden is on the government, any government, whichever political party that comes to power. That's their responsibility. They don't have an option. And this is why it's very critical for the voters to be able to ask the political parties, what is your policy on this? Then there should not be pie-in-the-sky stuff. There should be realistic propositions. So they all tie in, because right to housing and sanitation is also there. For example, when people's homes get blown away in a cyclone, we must provide or ensure that they have actual housing. It's not an option. And before, of course, we saw certain discriminatory practices too, that only certain groups of people were given housing in those kind of situations. We must not, for example, differentiate between those in the urban and rural areas. Sanitation is a right of every Fijian, whether you live in the islands, whether you live in the hills, or whether you live in the rural areas, not just people who live in the towns and cities. So these are the sort of issues that we're trying to address in this, and to ensure that all subsequent governments are always focused on these socioeconomic rights. These rights are also enforceable. In other words, you can go and seek redress. And then if you read here, it says, if the state claims that it does not have the resources to implement the right, it is the responsibility of the state to show that the resources are not available. So the burden is on the state. If you go along and say, look, I haven't got the housing, that I deserve to get, it's my right. The state, if it says, oh, we don't have the money, the state has to tell you why it doesn't have the money. Maybe it's spending, $10 million in fancy cars or whatever the case may be. So you say, hang on, you spend money on that. How come you didn't have money for, $1 million to, for example, provide very basic housing? So these are the sorts of checks and balances that have this constitution puts in. And I think these are the issues that people are actually very responsive to in a very positive manner, because they recognize that, yes, these are the issues that we want addressed. And yes, it means that it's applicable to all political parties, it's applicable to all future governments. And that's why this constitution is getting a very positive response also. Even if you look at the protection of Itauke, Rotuma and Bandaban lands, and the fact that there is a fair share of royalties, the fact there is protection for tenancies, not just now but in the future. So these protections are built in so people feel very safe. And then we can focus on other issues to engender economic growth, or thinking about economic growth, prosperity for the country, and making Fiji stronger.
Would you one may say, Mr. Said Kayum, that we're talking about the right to housing, the right to access to transportation, food and water, water especially roads. Yeah? One may say that the Bainimarama government has already paved the way because there's so much already done in terms of rural development.
Well, the difference is the Bainimarama government has done it without there being a constitutional requirement to do so. But what we're concerned about is also the future. We simply can't rely on the goodwill of future governments. I mean, the Bainimarama government was focused on these issues, but we want to put it in law to say that all governments should be focused on this. We need to think 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the track. All governments need to be focused on this. And indeed, if all governments are very genuinely focused on these aspects, then Fiji will just achieve its potential for growth and economic prosperity for all Fijians, in a very short period of time. And that is, of course, the objective.
And you're quite adamant and quite confident that this is the document to take us forward.
Absolutely.
Looking at the right to health, Mr. Saidkom, is this something new, or has it been in other constitutions as well?
Well, not in any of the Fijian constitutions. South Africa, for example, has it, and there's some wonderful jurisprudence or case law that's come out of this. There was, for example, a gentleman in South Africa by the name of Subramani, it's a well-known case now, who needed access to kidney dialysis. And he lived in a remote part of South Africa, and that health center did not have kidney dialysis machine. He's saying, my rights are being infringed by you not providing me or providing my hospital or health center with this kidney dialysis machine. So the state had to go and argue this case. Probably not the time to discuss this in your program. But it's a very interesting case. But these are the things that will develop in Fiji also. We need to develop a strong jurisprudence that deals with not just civil and political rights, but also socio-economic rights.
Well, Mr. Said Kayum, again, time has caught up with us. Any last words on the Constitution before we run things off?
Well, Roland, I think it sets out a very good framework for the governance of the country, accountability being built in, transparency, and also the ensuring and protection of rights of individual citizens. And it's there with a framework to set up a modern Fiji, recognizing the specific the rights of people, group rights, protection of land, recognition of culture, customs, tradition, but also at the same time creating common and equal citizenry, which is all modern nation states do that. It then also puts in place very strong accountable institutions that will hold public office holders accountable, and creating a system of governance that addresses these fundamental issues to help focus on the future.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sadkem. Before I let you go, is there any way, or if the public does need some clarification or questions on the Constitution, where can they contact?
Well, we've had various websites, government websites. You can go there. We've got a government Facebook page. There's information on the YouTube channel. We've got Twitter account for government. And so these are the avenues you can. We've also advertised in the papers about the people you can get in touch with if you have any clarification with the vernaculars, and we've received some feedback on that.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
That was Speak Your Mind again for this week. Until next week. Do join us again next week, Monday at 12 p.m. on Gold FM, and of course the replay on Tuesday nights on FBC TV. Until then, I'm Roland Moriman.